The Deathworld RX-9 loomed beneath the descending shuttlecraft like a molten bruise on the surface of the galaxy. Charred plains stretched for miles, broken by jagged cliffs, toxic geysers, and forests that glowed with bioluminescent menace. The atmosphere was breathable, but barely tolerable, and electromagnetic storms danced on the horizon like warning signs scrawled in lightning. The Galactic Academy had chosen this planet for one reason. Survival here was not about fighting, it was about not dying. Inside the shuttle, 15 cadets from 12 different species checked their gear. The Cataric twins from the Obsidian Moons clacked their bone-plated gauntlets, ready to test their brute strength. A cerulean with translucent skin hovered silently in meditation, her antennae flicking with faint energy as she scanned psychic patterns of nearby fauna. Others reviewed data on their wrist interfaces, pulling up schematics of known predators and potential hunting strategies. And then there was the human, Nick Morrow. He sat in the corner of the shuttle, silent and oddly relaxed, rubbing a piece of dull gray metal between his fingers. He didn't carry any weapon beyond a long survival knife and an old coil of synthetic rope looped across his shoulder. When asked what equipment he would bring for the hunting test, he had responded with 2 words. Just this. No plasma gun, no exosuit, no poison darts. The other cadets had laughed. One even offered to lend him a spare shock lance out of pity. He declined. Planetfall in 30 seconds, the AI pilot announced. Warning, the surface temperature exceeds safe thresholds for most species. Prolonged exposure without protection may result in cellular breakdown. The shuttle jolted as it entered the planet's turbulent atmosphere. Heat shields groaned, winds howled outside like hungry beasts. Nick felt the heat seep into his skin, but he didn't flinch. His eyes remained fixed on the jagged terrain ahead, studying the land as if it were a living entity, not just a battleground. On landing, the rear hatch burst open and the cadets scattered into the open, eager to claim territory and start the hunt. The first objective was simple: retrieve the tracker beacon embedded in a wild creature and return it alive. The catch? These creatures had evolved in a world designed to kill. Razor-spined lizards with corrosive spit, beetles the size of tanks, and serpentine mammals that moved like liquid metal, each more deadly than the last. Every movement here could trigger a chain of violent reactions. Even the wind smelled like acid. Within the first hour, the Obsidian twins had already engaged in battle. Their target, a tusked quadruped with obsidian scales, had rammed through their reinforced shield like paper. The cadets managed to wound it, but not before one of them was sent flying into a sulfur pool. Screams echoed over the comms. The cerulean tried to tame a flock of hovering raptors with neural pulses. The creatures responded by swarming her in a frenzy of screeches and talons. She barely made it out, her skin torn and glowing faint blue with shock toxins. Others fared no better. Traps were triggered prematurely, nets were shredded mid-air, and every victory came at the cost of exhaustion or injury. Meanwhile, Nick had walked away from the drop site alone, without a word. He moved deliberately, noting wind patterns and vegetation behavior. Where others saw terrain, he saw a system, an ecosystem reacting to their presence. He walked until the voices of the other cadets faded from his communicator. Only then did he stop. He found a small ridge overlooking a muddy clearing ringed by sharp-edged trees. A stream of bubbling green water flowed nearby, likely laced with chemicals. But the area was flat and visible from all sides, a perfect place to build. He dropped his pack and got to work. The first thing he did was gather stones, not to throw or build a weapon, but to arrange them. He created a circle, then lines branching outward. It looked like nothing at first, until he poured a line of nutrient powder from his emergency rations along the outer perimeter. Then he sliced into a pouch of earth seeds, modified resilient ones designed for extreme climates, and began planting. Carefully, precisely, each hole filled with a calculated amount of moisture from his hydration pack. Within an hour, the area around the stone circle looked like a microgarden. His second task was to dig, not randomly but methodically, using the curvature of the land to his advantage. With a modified shovel head he'd crafted from broken plating, Nick shaped a trench from the nearby stream, directing filtered water toward his garden area. He didn't drink the water directly. He'd packed purification tablets for that. But the plants? They could adapt, and some even thrived on hostile minerals. By midday, while the others were still clashing with predators, Nick had built a windbreak from felled tree limbs, tied together with fiber rope and reinforced with mud. He tested the structure against the wind, added rocks for support, and lined the inside with dried foliage. It wasn't flashy, but it was sturdy and warm. He had a shelter, not just a place to hide. The sun on RX-9 didn't set normally. It dimmed like a dying torch, giving the sky a blood-orange hue that stained everything. That's when the real danger began. Night on this planet wasn't quiet, it was alive. Creatures howled, growled, and screamed in the distance, many of them sounding far too close for comfort. Nick remained calm. He started a fire using friction, using local bark he'd dried earlier and resin he'd collected from a toxic shrub. Flammable, volatile, but controllable. He cooked his remaining rations carefully, eating in silence as eyes watched him from the tree line. That night, while others screamed through the comms, begging for reinforcements or medical drones, Nick slept lightly, wrapped in his heat-reflective blanket, listening to the sounds of the jungle. He noted the rhythms, the changes, the silences, especially the silences. Those often meant a predator was near, and one was, she came after midnight. A massive, quadrupedal beast with claws like blades and eyes that shimmered in the dark. She sniffed the edge of his clearing, drawn by the scent of cooked protein and perhaps the anomaly of calm in a world of chaos. But she didn't attack. Nick had laid out food, scraps of cooked meat, deliberately placed on a stone slab away from the fire. The creature took the offering, sniffed again, then vanished into the brush. Nick didn't move. He only smiled faintly and whispered to himself, "She'll be back." By dawn, the garden showed signs of sprouting. The shelter stood strong, the trench flowed, and the feeding slab was empty. Nick stood at the edge of the ridge, looking out at the rising heat shimmering over the jungle. He tapped his communicator and heard static, cries for help, and the groans of wounded cadets. He turned it off. He didn't need help. He wasn't here to fight. He was here to adapt. And the Deathworld, brutal as it was, had just blinked first. By the second morning on RX-9, panic had begun to seep into the comm channels like blood into water. The hunting teams that had proudly stormed into the wilderness were now fractured, scattered across the Deathworld's volatile landscape, licking wounds and nursing egos bruised far deeper than flesh. The terrain had rejected their aggression. What had seemed like a challenge to prove dominance had become a grim lesson in humility. A violet dawn crawled across the sky, casting razor-like shadows across the broken ground. The air buzzed with invisible spores that irritated unshielded lungs. At the Academy's designated fallback point, cadets staggered back in groups of 2 or 3, those who could still walk. The others either lay sedated in medical pods or hadn't made it back at all. Of the original 15, only 8 remained uninjured, and even among those, morale had collapsed. Bekar, the youngest of the Obsidian twins, limped through the camp perimeter with dried blood caked on his left mandible. His armor was cracked. One of his 6 fingers hung limp, and his once pristine reputation as a top predator now carried the stain of humiliation. Beside him, Professor Nivex, a crystalline being who shimmered like fractured ice, observed the dwindling cohort through multifaceted eyes. She said nothing, only logged every detail silently into her neural archive. There would be no sympathy. This was RX-9. Sympathy was a luxury no species could afford here. But amidst the breakdown, a curious report reached her. Aerial drones, launched to monitor cadet movements for safety protocol compliance, had flagged an anomaly in Quadrant 7. The footage showed a cleared zone, organized into geometrical plots with evidence of water diversion and cultivated growth. Initial scans detected increasing oxygen saturation in the immediate vicinity, an impossible result for a zone with no known photosynthetic life forms. There was also the presence of a large quadruped that repeatedly entered and exited the area, not to attack, to feed. There was only one cadet unaccounted for in Quadrant 7, Nick Morrow. Word spread quickly. The remaining cadets, bruised and exhausted, watched the drone feed with disbelief. He wasn't just alive, he was thriving. While others had battled beasts and fled into caves, he had set up a farm? Laughter mixed with resentment. Makar scoffed, his pride pricked. A farm will not protect him when the Kraxen returns, he muttered. The cerulean girl, seated nearby with bandaged antennae, said nothing, but her eyes lingered on the footage of Nick longer than anyone else's. Meanwhile, in Quadrant 7, Nick crouched near the edge of his small cultivated plot, inspecting the growth of his seedlings. Tiny green shoots had broken the surface overnight, fast even by genetically modified standards. He suspected the soil's high sulfur content was accelerating growth in ways Earth's labs never predicted. He took a sample with a small scoop and slid it into his scanner. Readouts blinked in confirmation. Trace elements of ammonium nitrate and alien minerals unknown to Earth, rich in growth potential if balanced correctly. He smiled. Nature here didn't resist cultivation. It simply required decoding. His shelter had been upgraded overnight. Using fibrous bark from a vine-like growth he had discovered to the south, he reinforced the roof and added a rain catchment system. The filtered runoff filled his storage containers, while excess water flowed into the trench, feeding the crops. Each hour, the system became more self-sustaining. Efficiency over power, balance over brute force. But the most significant development had occurred just before dawn. She had returned. The massive creature, the same one from the previous night, had approached his camp again. Silent, deliberate, watching from a distance. She hadn't growled or postured, only sniffed the edge of the garden and waited. Nick had prepared more food. This time, he placed it slightly closer to the fire, closer to him. The message was simple. Trust. She ate. Now, as the sun broke through the stormy clouds, the creature lay resting near the perimeter of his camp, still tense, still alert, but not aggressive. Her muscles twitched occasionally, reacting to distant sounds, but her eyes never left him. Nick understood that proximity alone didn't mean domestication. Trust was a currency, and he was still earning it, one interaction at a time. By midday, he began experimenting with tools. Using scraps from his emergency kit and local materials, he built a basic irrigation valve to control water flow to the different crop patches. Every movement he made was watched by the creature. When he walked, she followed at a distance. When he worked, she remained still, only tilting her head or shifting her tail. He began speaking aloud, not for communication. He didn't expect her to understand English, but to establish rhythm and familiarity. Tone mattered more than meaning. "All right, big girl," he said, tightening a knot on the makeshift pulley system he was rigging for his drying rack. "Let's see if this holds." The rope pulled taut. The structure didn't collapse. He exhaled in satisfaction. Progress. A sudden screech in the distance made him freeze. The creature's ears flicked forward. Without warning, she rose and bolted into the jungle, vanishing between the trees like smoke. Nick watched her go, noting the direction, northeast, toward a cliffside he hadn't yet explored. He marked it mentally. Something had stirred her instincts. Perhaps it was another predator, or prey, or something stranger. Either way, he knew she'd return if she chose to. He didn't try to follow. That wasn't how trust worked. Instead, he returned to his tasks. The day passed with quiet industry. He expanded the garden, reinforced the windbreak, and began mapping a rudimentary calendar based on the planet's solar cycles. He observed insect migration, temperature shifts, and shadow angles, gathering data to build something sustainable. When dusk fell, the jungle again erupted in chaos, screams, rustles, thunderous footsteps far beyond his immediate clearing. But Nick was prepared. He had widened the fire pit, stacked repellents made from crushed local herbs, and placed sharpened stakes around the perimeter, not to harm, but to alert. Anything large enough to breach his space would have to make noise first, but nothing came, except her. Just after dark, the creature returned, covered in red smears that weren't hers. She carried something in her jaws. He couldn't see what at first until she dropped it gently at the edge of the firelight. A smaller beast. Dead, intact, fresh, an offering. Nick didn't move for several seconds. He stared at the creature, at the carcass, at the look in her eyes. Calm, focused, waiting. She had brought him food. Whether it was a gesture of kinship or a simple mimicry of his actions, it didn't matter. The message was clear. She no longer saw him as prey, or even intruder. She saw him as something different. He approached the carcass slowly, crouched beside it and examined the kill. The muscle was firm, the cut marks were precise. This was no clumsy mauling. This was a surgical hunt. He looked up at the creature and nodded once. "Thank you." She didn't respond, only settled onto her haunches, curling her tail around her legs like a house cat far too large for its own comfort. He prepared a fire roast from the kill, setting aside a portion raw and unseasoned. He slid the raw meat toward her on a large stone slab, just as he had done the previous night. She accepted it without hesitation. That night, Nick didn't sleep inside the shelter. He slept near the fire, under the open sky, the creature lying nearby. Not close, but not far. Close enough that if something else came, she'd hear it first, and maybe, just maybe, she would do more than watch. As the stars wheeled overhead and the planet's second moon bled silver light onto the treetops, Nick stared up into the sky and whispered to no one in particular, "I didn't come here to conquer you." RX-9 didn't answer, but the silence didn't feel hostile anymore. The third day began with an unnatural quiet. Not the gentle stillness of peace, but the tight, breathless silence that falls when the jungle knows something is coming. Nick woke before the twin suns had breached the horizon. His eyes opened sharply, his breath shallow. The fire had long since reduced to embers, but the warmth of the night still clung to his skin. He remained motionless for a full minute, scanning the perimeter with practiced stillness. The creature, his unlikely guardian, was not where she had slept. The stone slab where he'd left food the night before remained untouched. Her absence tightened his chest in a way he hadn't expected. He stood slowly, brushing dirt from his back and moving toward the garden. The sprouts had multiplied overnight, small shoots forming uniform rows of pale green against the ashen ground. He dropped to one knee and ran his fingers along the soil. Moisture levels were adequate, but something beneath the surface felt off. The air was too still. No birds, no insects, no rustle of low-dwelling herbivores. RX-9 wasn't resting. It was holding its breath. Then he heard it, a low, rolling growl that rumbled not through the air, but through the earth. It came from the northeast, the same direction the creature had vanished toward during the previous day. Nick turned his head sharply, every muscle alert. He sprinted to the ridge beyond his clearing and dropped to his belly to stay below the line of the jagged rocks. He scanned the tree line with a pair of scavenged binoculars he had repaired on his first night. What he saw drained the heat from his blood. 4 Kraxen were moving in formation across the jungle basin below. Not solitary hunters like the one he had encountered, but a pack. Sleek and low to the ground, their scales shimmered faintly in the half-light, their movement disturbingly synchronized. This wasn't a hunt. It was a sweep. One of them lifted its massive head and let out a roar so deep it made birds burst from the canopy miles away. He knew immediately what it meant. Territory dispute. She had been part of a pack, and she was no longer welcome. He dropped behind the ridge and considered his options. If the pack had sensed her presence near his farm, they would come for her. And if she led them here, intentionally or not, they would raze everything in their path. His crops, his shelter, his attempt at harmony would be reduced to blood and ash. The jungle would reset itself, as it always had, through violence. He couldn't allow that. He had built something here, something fragile but alive. He moved quickly, packing essentials into a sling, purified water, emergency rations, signal flares, and the handmade knife he'd modified with obsidian fragments for extra cutting power. He left the rest behind, tools, notebooks, even his shelter. If he failed, none of it would matter. If he succeeded, he could rebuild. He followed the ridgeline northeast, ducking under thorned vines and leaping over roots as thick as his leg. His pace was controlled but fast, feet silent on the damp earth, eyes scanning for tracks. 2 hours in, he found blood. Not a smear, but a streak. Long, dark, and recent. The soil was disturbed, heavy prints dug deep into the ground. Her prints. But they were paired with others, more aggressive, spaced tighter, claws gouging into bark and stone. She was being hunted. She hadn't brought the kill to him as a gift. She had marked herself a traitor. He followed the trail into a hollow between cliffs, where steam hissed from volcanic vents and sulfur stung the eyes. The terrain made tracking harder, but he pressed on, guided by instinct more than vision. Then he heard a crash. Wood splintering, stone cracking, and a roar that nearly shattered his teeth. He crept forward, climbed a narrow ledge, and looked down into the pit. She was fighting for her life. 3 Kraxen surrounded her, slashing and lunging in brutal silence. There was no howling, no vocal dominance, only cold, methodical violence. She was already wounded, her left flank bleeding, one leg dragging. But she didn't fall back. She spun in place, tail whipping like a blade, jaws snapping at anything within reach. She wasn't trying to win, she was trying to delay. The fourth Kraxen emerged from the shadow behind her. A larger male, twice her size, scarred and missing one eye. Alpha. Nick didn't think. He moved. He slid down the ridge, dislodging a rock that clattered into the arena. All four predators turned, eyes locking onto him. He pulled the flare from his belt, struck it, and hurled it directly into the face of the largest Kraxen. The blinding white light exploded on impact, and the creature shrieked in rage. The others recoiled instinctively. In that moment, she lunged, slamming into the one on her right and tearing into its throat with a guttural snarl. Nick ran toward her, dodging a swipe from another beast, and rolled beside her body. She turned to snap at him, blood mad, but stopped when she recognized his scent. He raised his hands slowly. "Let's go," he whispered. "Now." She limped forward, and he followed, hurling a second flare behind them. It bought them only seconds, but it was enough. They reached the edge of the pit where he had spotted a narrow passage through the cliff wall. It was barely wide enough for her, but she forced herself through, scraping against the stone, bleeding with every step. Nick stayed at her side, guiding, urging, using his knife to clear obstacles. The passage opened into a canyon choked with steam and mud. Visibility dropped to nothing, but the Kraxen didn't follow. They feared this place. The ground shifted under their feet, soft and unstable. Nick knew this kind of terrain. He'd trained in it on Earth. Volcanic marshlands, unpredictable but survivable if you knew where to step. He led her to a cluster of boulders partially submerged in bubbling pools. She collapsed behind them, breathing raggedly. He dug into his sling, pulled out the purification tablets and mixed them with warm water. She refused at first, snarling weakly, but he pressed the makeshift bowl against her tongue. She drank. Hours passed as he tended to her wounds. He used sterilized cloth from his emergency bandages, packed the deeper gashes with antibiotic gel, and wrapped her limbs with strips of his own shirt. She never slept, only watched him with those yellow eyes, unblinking, half-trusting. At sunset, the air cooled and the jungle behind them remained silent. No pursuit, for now. Nick leaned back against a stone, his hands sore, his body shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. She shifted beside him, resting her massive head near his legs. It wasn't submission, it was acknowledgement. He had risked his life for hers. That meant something on RX-9. He looked up at the darkening sky, muscles aching, and whispered, "We'll need a new home." The jungle didn't answer, but she didn't leave. The canyon floor cooled quickly as the light faded, the air thick with sulfur and minerals that shimmered faintly in the low light. Nick awoke just before dawn, muscles stiff from sleeping on uneven stone, the stale warmth of the volcanic mist clinging to his clothes. The creature remained beside him, her massive chest rising and falling in a slow, strained rhythm. She had slept, though lightly. Every noise from the jungle made her ears twitch. Every distant rumble brought her one breath closer to waking. But she had stayed, rooted to him, like a shadow with its own will. Nick pulled himself up and moved quietly toward the canyon's southern edge. The marshland beyond the boulders was dangerous, but it was also isolated. No other cadet would venture here, and judging by the lack of any recent tracks, the Kraxen pack had no interest in returning. Still, he couldn't linger. She needed recovery, and he needed structure. The canyon was only a temporary refuge, not a place to build anything permanent. He mapped the terrain in his mind as he scouted. 2 ridges to the east, one sloping path up the cliff wall, and a copse of ironbark trees on the far side of the steaming flat. The trees were the key. Strong enough for support beams, fire-resistant, and rich in internal resin that could be purified into fuel. He returned to the boulders, checked her wounds again, and whispered, "We move tonight." She blinked once. It was enough. The day passed in slow preparation. He gathered dry foliage for padding, constructed a crude sled from scavenged branches, and looped his rope to form a harness. She was too injured to walk the entire route, but not so broken that she couldn't be guided. He reinforced the sled's underside with strips of bark and layered it with moss. Every movement had to be silent. If the Kraxen caught their scent, a second escape would not be possible. When night fell, they began the trek. He walked ahead with a lit branch dipped in purified oil, the flame faint but enough to reveal unstable ground. She followed, dragging one leg but keeping pace with steady determination. When the slope became too steep or the mud too deep, she allowed him to guide her onto the sled. She didn't growl or resist anymore. She understood the necessity. Trust had become instinct. It took 6 hours to reach the Ironwood Copse. By then the moons had set and the stars were smeared behind sulfur clouds. Nick collapsed beside the largest tree, chest heaving, throat raw from breathing in the toxic air. She slumped beside him, exhausted but alive. In the morning, he began the rebuild. The new shelter rose more slowly than the first. He lacked the clear terrain, the water flow, the efficient systems he had engineered back in the garden. But this location offered different strengths: thicker wood, better elevation, and natural barriers. He felled the smaller ironwoods with his obsidian knife, lashed their trunks with vines, and used volcanic stone to weigh the frame into place. The result was a low, curved structure nestled into the cliffside and reinforced with overlapping bark panels. Not elegant, but defensible. He created a perimeter by digging shallow ditches and filling them with shards of glassy rock to produce sound when stepped on. A line of sharpened sticks formed the first line of defense. The second line was her. By the third day in the new camp, she was walking again. The limp remained, but her stride had regained purpose. She stalked the perimeter each morning, sniffing the trees and snarling low at anything that moved too quickly. Nick watched her without interference. She didn't need commands. She knew her role. At night, she returned to his side and lay near the fire. He shared his rations with her, offering cuts of dried meat soaked in marrow broth. She never took more than what he gave, never begged, never snapped. She had learned patience, and with it came something stranger: routine. He began calling her Sura. He didn't know why. The name surfaced in his mind one morning as she drank from the filtered runoff near the ridge. It felt right. Short, strong, not too soft. She responded to it, tilting her head when he spoke it aloud. That was enough. Sura was no longer just a creature surviving the Deathworld. She was part of something now, part of him. Nick began teaching her. Not language. He doubted she could understand words the way a human or even a high-level alien might, but rhythm, symbols, cause and effect. He marked trees with different scents, colors, and shapes, watching how she reacted. Red meant danger, yellow meant food, circles meant camp. After a week, she began to associate the symbols with action. She avoided red, returned to yellow, and stayed within the circle-marked boundary without being told. But the greatest breakthrough came when he discovered her sound mimicry. One evening, while preparing a smoke signal device using local resin and a heat coil, Nick hummed a slow tune to himself, an old earth melody, forgotten but soothing. Sura, lying nearby, opened her jaws and let out a low, warbling sound that mimicked the rhythm almost exactly. Not the pitch, not the tone, but the pattern. He froze, stunned, then repeated the melody. She responded, again, this time slightly closer. She was listening, learning. The realization changed everything. He began integrating her into every process, letting her pull vines for shelter building, using her size to move rocks, even having her stand watch while he worked. She took to the tasks with quiet diligence. She wasn't a pet. She wasn't a weapon. She was a partner. One night, as they sat beside the fire, he stared at the dark sky where distant planets glimmered like ghosts. He thought of the other cadets, what they might be doing, what the instructors would make of his progress, or if they even knew he was alive. He hadn't checked the communicator in days. He didn't need it. The jungle gave him all the feedback he required. Sura lifted her head and looked toward the southern ridge. Her body stiffened. Nick stood and followed her gaze. He couldn't see anything yet, but the silence told him enough. Something was out there, watching, waiting. Not crack sand, something smarter. He placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "Let's prepare." She didn't growl. She simply moved beside him. They were no longer running. They were defending home. The jungle on RX-9 did not warn its prey with sound. It watched in silence, breathing through the leaves and branches, allowing fear to take root before revealing its teeth. Nick stood motionless near the edge of the camp, the obsidian-tipped spear in his hand glinting in the dull firelight. Sura remained beside him, her body low, tail coiled close to the ground. Her eyes did not blink. Her ears twitched once, southwest direction. The wind carried the scent of sweat, metal, and uncertainty. He hadn't touched his communicator in over a week. He had stopped counting the days. But now, as the foreign presence approached from the shadows, he knew the outside world had finally arrived. Not predators, not the pack, something different. Sura sensed it too. She was alert but not defensive. Curious more than hostile, a low whine cut through the stillness, a mechanical pulse sweeping the air like sonar. Nick's eyes narrowed. That wasn't a beast. That was a scout drone. He dropped into a crouch and whispered, "Stay." Sura didn't move, but her muscles flexed, prepared to launch if needed. He stepped toward the sound, weaving between the thick trunks and bramble thickets, using the terrain he had memorized like the lines on his own palm. He spotted the drone first. Silver, silent, hovering 2 meters above the ground. It blinked a soft blue light, scanning the terrain, and then zoomed toward the cliffs. A second followed, slower, broadcasting a small hologram above its frame. The insignia of the Galactic Academy shimmered into view. He exhaled through his nose and stepped into the open. The drones halted and shifted their scan toward him. One beeped. Another projected a rotating 3D image of Nick's Academy ID with a glowing green verification mark. Moments later, a voice crackled through a concealed speaker. Professor Nivex. "Cadet Nick Morrow, your vitals indicate full survival status. The exam phase ends in 12 minutes. Stand by for retrieval." The words were sterile, clinical, the voice devoid of praise or concern. Protocol, not empathy. He turned and walked back to the camp. Sura hadn't moved from her position. When she saw him approach, her posture relaxed slightly. He didn't speak. There was no need. He began breaking down the camp, dismantling the drying racks, rolling up his tools, and burying the rest. What couldn't be carried would be left to the jungle. He worked with precise speed, driven by something deeper than instruction. 12 minutes? He didn't know what they would do with her. She wasn't just another creature. She was something more. But the Academy wouldn't care. The exam had parameters. The Academy respected statistics, not sentiment. She was a variable, unrecorded, unauthorized, and to them, dangerous. When the retrieval ship arrived, it did not roar like the transports used on Earth. It slid through the clouds like a shadow, its vertical thrusters barely disturbing the trees. The landing pad extended silently, and a group of armored personnel stepped down, 4 officers and 1 instructor. Professor Nivik stood in the center, translucent skin refracting the light, her face unreadable as always. She approached Nick, her data tablet hovering in front of her, recording everything. She didn't look at the camp. She looked only at him. "You exceeded your assignment," she said. "You did not return a specimen." "I didn't need to," he replied. "She came willingly." The instructor's crystalline fingers hovered over the tablet. "You interfered with the ecological balance of the region. Your actions disrupted a territorial structure and introduced domestic patterns into a Class E predator." "I adapted," he answered. Silence passed between them. Behind her, the officers shifted uneasily. Sura emerged from the shadows then, her full form illuminated for the first time by the ship's floodlights. The moment she stepped into the clearing, every officer raised a weapon. One aimed a tranquilizer rifle. She stopped, head high, tail rigid, eyes fixed on Nick. "Hold fire," Nick said sharply, stepping between her and the rifles. "She won't attack. She is still feral," one of the officers argued. "She's more disciplined than any cadet who fled the first night," he snapped. "And she didn't leave me." Nivek's head tilted slightly. "This was a hunting examination. You did not hunt." "No," he said calmly. "I built. I observed. I made contact. I earned her trust. The others chased trophies. I created something that didn't exist before." She considered his words. Behind her, the ship's systems whirred softly, preparing for departure. "What would you have us do with her?" she asked at last. "Let her stay," he said. "She knows the territory. She'll survive." "She doesn't belong in a cage." "That is not the standard outcome. Neither was my performance." Another silence. Then, with a flick of her hand, Nivex gestured to the officers. The rifles lowered. Sura remained perfectly still. "You will be evaluated accordingly," she said. "Board the transport." He turned to Sura and stepped close. She sniffed him once, her breath warm against his chest. He touched her scarred shoulder gently. "You're free now," he said softly. "You don't need me to survive." She looked at him, then at the ship, then back at the jungle. And without a sound, she turned and vanished into the trees. He boarded the shuttle in silence. The flight back to the orbital station was short. When he arrived, he was taken directly to the debriefing chamber. His performance metrics scrolled across the wall. Survival, 100%. Combat, 0%. Innovation, 240%. Resourcefulness, off scale. He was given no applause. He was given distinction. Weeks later, when the Academy published the official summary of the RX-9 survival exam, his name appeared under a new classification, Adaptive Integration Candidate, a program created to explore new approaches to nonviolent planetary interaction. The rest of the cadets were archived under traditional categories. He never returned to RX-9, but satellite footage months later showed something strange. In the quadrant once marked hostile and uninhabitable, a clearing had appeared. Geometric rows of unfamiliar vegetation had taken root. Crude markers, symbols painted in circles and slashes, lined the trees. And in the center, a lone creature sat watching the sky, still waiting beside a smooth stone slab, waiting for the one who had taught her what trust meant in a world built on fear. The Deathworld had not been tamed, but something in it had changed forever.